Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Game Changer. I'm Mariam Zia. In today's program, we will be talking about one of the most pressing issues of our time, that is the global impact of Russia-Ukraine war. Of course, when we talk about Russia-Ukraine war, this is impacting economies of the developing world, especially because a number of developing countries and emerging economies are dependent on their food supplies and energy supplies on this region that is conflict-ridden at the moment. In today's program, we will be talking about the repercussions of Russia-Ukraine war on the world, especially when we talk about its economic implications as well as implications on the food security and energy security of the world. We will also be talking about its impact on Pakistan and the emerging alliances that we are witnessing in today's world. We will also be talking about the significance of multilateral institutions and the role they can play in dealing with humanitarian crises emerging as a result of this particular conflict. To discuss this and more, we are joined in the studios by Mr. Shehjar Khan, who is expert in international affairs. Welcome to the program. We are also joined by Mr. Rashid Wali, who is expert in international affairs and senior analyst. Welcome to the program. And we are joined online by Dr. Zafar Nawaz Jaspal, who is expert in international affairs. Welcome to the program. Mr. Shehjar, let me start with you. Of course, when we talk about this important conflict in the region, it has been over a year that we have been witnessing the implications and consequences of this war, and not only the people of that particular countries are impacted by this war, but we are witnessing its triple effect throughout the world. So can you tell us about the immediate impact, especially when we talk about the geopolitical implications of Russia-Ukraine war?
So Mariam, other than the humanitarian loss, the loss in terms of life, the loss in terms of infrastructure due to the war between Ukraine and Russia, there has been like a lot of like devastating impacts on the global economy as well. Now, even before like this war was like took place when Russia invaded Ukraine, we have to like keep in mind that when it comes to Russia was like supplying 46% of European Union's oil and gas supplies. Historically, European Union was importing a lot of like oil from the Gulf countries, and that was always very unstable because of the instability in the Middle East, and all of these shipments, oil imports were taking place through ships. So European Union needed a consistent supply of gas and oil, and that it got from the Russian pipelines. And it was consistent, and around 46% of European Union's needs were being met by Russian oil and gas. Now, other than that, this region is also known as the breadbasket of Europe. It produces around 36% of global wheat supplies. Other than that, Ukraine is also the largest producer of sunflower oil as well, and it also like exports all of these items to developing countries mostly. So the largest importer of wheat from Russia, for example, is Turkey. It's like Indonesia. It's countries from Southeast Asia. Other than that, when it comes to African countries like Morocco, other African countries, Turkey as well, Indonesia as well, they import a lot of like wheat from Ukraine. So you can like see that a lot of like developing countries, upcoming countries, they are very dependent on import of wheat, which is a staple food, and that like comes from Ukraine. When this war started, Russia also had an embargo, so it wouldn't like let all of these exports through. And then Turkey brokered a deal between Russia and like the supplies continued. But obviously, it's a political issue.
There are still disruptions going on. Mr. Rashid, when we talk about this conflict in particular, what are the immediate effects on the neighboring countries when we talk about specifically about the disruption of global food supply, and how significant role this is going to play in especially the political developments within those neighboring countries, because we know that price hikes are the result of these disruptions in the global food supplies?
The impact is a butterfly impact. It's not only the neighboring regions, but it's more like sub-Saharan African region is most impacted. Even South Asia is impacted. Middle Eastern countries which were dependent, countries like Lebanon, their food inflation has gone astronomically high, mind-boggling figures of 396% something. That is a very palpable impact, and we know that the Black Sea grain initiative, that has also stalled.
Yes.
Because the Russians, once they were subjected to some kind of retaliation from Ukraine, they have stalled that deal, and which is leading to a lot of complications. In last 16 months, there have been shipments which have been completely lying bottled up in the Black Sea region, and the grain is getting wasted. Ukraine used to supply its food stocks for 400 million of the global population. So you can have a grasp of the figures, how much effect it would have created. We know the figures, it ranges from 12.6% and above. It peaked at May 2022, and the figures, though the prices have plateaued a bit, but it's still 20% higher than what it was 2 years ago. So the impact of the food inflation on countries where in sub-Saharan countries where the food inflation accounts for major part of CPI basket, that is a very serious impact on their economies, especially the households. Then there is the problem in the Ukraine itself, because the most of the households, they were engaged in agriculture, and especially the gender gap in the food insecurity, which was 1.1%, it has now come to 4%, and the households have impacted because the energy infrastructure has been badly hit.
Of course.
There have been 4,000 to 6,000 missiles which have hit their energy power plants, transformers, cables. So it's a completely destabilized economic environment inside Ukraine, and their food stocks are lying fallow, their fields are not being cultivated, and this year because of the energy shortages, they cannot run the agriculture irrigation system. So because of that, next year the impact could be even worse.
Worst, of course. And when we talk about the ripple effects of this conflict, of course, the ripple effects can be felt across the globe. But Dr. Jaspal, what is the role of multilateral organizations, and specifically when we talk about food and agriculture organizations, to mitigate the impacts of this food crisis or food security that the world is witnessing at the moment, and the price hikes that are resulting in the developing countries?
You have very rightly pointed out that this food crisis, which is in the world and which we are linking with the Ukraine war and the Russian invasion, it has been impacting the developing world as well as the developed world too much. As you pointed out, the international organizations have been playing their role. But in this war, if you see the Western powers which are dominating the international organizations, they wanted to bleed the Russia. The Americans led West has adopted sanctions policies against the Russians, and the Russian grain is not going into the international market, or it's becoming very costly. Their oil is becoming very costly, or this kind of thing. Similarly, Russians have blocked the Ukrainian ports, and as a result, the entire world is suffering from it. In reality, if we can focus on these kind of the organizations, we find that international food organizations, frankly speaking, have been failed in addressing these kind of things.
Right. So when we talk about specifically about the monoculture economies, the economies that are specifically dependent on a specific products for imports, what are those countries that were largely dependent on imports coming from Russia and Ukraine, and what are the impacts, and how are they addressing those challenges?
Look, this is very simplistic, that when we look about these kind of the things which were dependent on the Russia, they are suffering more because the Russians are, due to the war, they are facing a lot of sanctions, and anything which is coming out of the Russia is difficult. And because of the sanctions fears, or because of these kind of things, they are becoming very costly. Similarly, in this context, when we see the Western nations are not determined, especially America's coalition partner, that they want to punish the Russia. And in this context, they are not taking into account what is this sanctions policy. Their sanctions policy is impact on the developed world, especially less developed countries in Asia, Africa. So by this way, you can find that these kind of the developments are pinching or having a very furthest impact on the economy.
Right. So of course, that is important, but this has also led to fluctuations in global energy prices as well. Dr. Jaspal, how are countries of the world dealing with this crisis, and what are some of the lessons that Pakistan can learn from these countries as a result of global energy price fluctuations?
I think that the global energy fluctuation is there, and as a result, the prices are disturbed. Pakistan has to learn how to, you can say, increase its options. Pakistan's too much options are limited, and now we started developing a option with cultivating relations with Russia. Unfortunately, we failed to benefit from it because of our too much dependency and our international monetary institutions. But in this case, when you are looking about the oil prices, with international market increases, that has a negative impact on the domestic market of Pakistan, and as a result, we have been suffering a lot. Now, in this context, Pakistan approached the Russians for purchasing the cheap oil, but again, that is not becoming a workable strategy so far. But we have succeeded, but we have to stick with these, what you call it, multidimensional strategy in the case of purchasing the oil or these kind of the carbon resources. So the best option is that we try to go for and chalk out our policies in a manner that will benefit us. But of course, when there is a war in Europe and Russia is engaged, Russia is one of the biggest producer of the oil, definitely when the impact comes, that
Right. Of course. When we talk about a global energy crisis, this leads us to the important question of diversifying our energy resources and also moving towards the alternate energy resources as well. And a number of European countries that were previously dependent on Russia for their energy supplies are exploring those options as well. What are those countries, and what are some of the lessons that Pakistan can learn regarding diversifying our energy options or resources?
So, Mariam, this is a very interesting question. A lot of countries or multilateral agencies are not talking about it much, but diversifying energy needs and the energy mix is not a very easy process. Mm-hmm. First of all, what we have to see is that ever since the European Union has placed Russia on sanctions, and they have basically said that they have banned imports of Russian oil, what the trends that we have seen emerging are that countries like India, they are basically buying Russian crude oil on heavily discounted prices. Then they are refining it in Indian refineries and then selling that oil back to the European Union. So this is a way of circumventing the sanctions that Russia is under, and they're also making huge profit margins in the process. Why? Because European Union is very dependent on oil. It is very dependent on gas for their energy needs, for the heating. And now that the winter is approaching again, we'll see a surge in energy prices again in European Union and rest of the countries as well. A lot of these countries, for example, due to geopolitics and other strategic measures, the US asked the Saudis to basically increase their production of oil. And we also have to see this in the backdrop of the whole COVID crisis as well. This war basically started or was initiated when the world was just getting out of COVID. And we can see because of this, a lot of international air travel prices are through the roof. They're very expensive. Now the countries want to make money which they could not during the 2.5 years of the COVID crisis that was taking place. So a lot of OPEC countries did not want to increase the production of oil to bring the prices down. So the international oil prices we see have consistently been rising. Yes. And a lot of countries, developing countries, especially Pakistan, their import bill consists heavily of oil imports. And a lot of developing countries produce energy from oil and gas as well. So
how is Pakistan engaging with these international organizations to address the energy security concerns?
So the only thing Pakistan can do now is to move towards alternative energy. Pakistan is already building dams. It's very dependent on oil imports and gas imports. A lot of like intermittent IPPs that Pakistan has, the controversial IPPs. So those have to run, capacity charges have to be paid. So it's very difficult for Pakistan to even move into solar and like alternative energy when Pakistan is investing so much into building dams. So what we basically need to do is we need to make a holistic strategy that looks at Pakistan's energy needs for the next 20 to 25 years and then like make a more holistic policy. That is what I basically see.
So Dr. Jaspal, in your opinion, what are the geopolitical implications of Russia-Ukraine war, and specifically when we talk about Pakistan's foreign policy, how has Pakistan's, in your opinion, aligned its foreign policies to these changing geopolitical dynamics?
Pakistan's foreign policy need to revisit, and of course the government of Pakistan has chalked out its policy keeping in mind the transformation in the global politics. If you see that we have a world that is now evolving into two or a trilateral way, where one is Russia, China, and the US, but in that context, when we look at it at a broader perspective, we find that there is a strategic contest is going or evolving between the China and the Russian, between China and the United States, and the alignments are taking place. Of course, Pakistan's official stance is that we are going to maintain the neutrality and we are not going into the bloc system or a bloc politics. But unfortunately, the world is shaping in a manner in which the bloc politics is becoming more and more significant. For instance, our neighbor, which was involved yesterday's, on 28th terrorism in Pakistan, 29th terrorism in Pakistan, that is becoming a threshold ally of the United States, and it is joining the Quad, AUKUS plus it is demanding I2U2. In such a situation, of course, our foreign policy cannot ignore these kind of the developments. Naturally, we are a strategic economic partner of the China. In that context, we have cultivated a better relation in the last 2 decades with the Russia, and we are still with that we wanted to maintain economic relations with Russia. But at the same time, we are avoiding to become a part of what we call a strategic partnership, going to transform or evolving into a threshold ally and ending up to an alliance. But of course, Pakistan's foreign policy need you can say, very much genuinely, as well as we have to adjust ourselves with the changing circumstances.
Right. We are talking about repercussions of Russia-Ukraine war. We will be talking about other dimensions of this conflict, but after a short break. Welcome back. We are talking about the global impact of Russia-Ukraine war, and of course, when we talk about this conflict, multilateral organizations and their role is also significant to discuss. And Mr. Rashid, when we talk about this particular conflict, how do you view the role of United Nations in this regard and the efforts made by UN to address the crisis, maybe?
You see, United Nations has done its best, but we very well know that the contest is between the global powers and their proxies in the Western Hemisphere, where the veto wielding powers, they have the last say. So United Nations has already played its part, and its affiliated organizations like World Food Programme is doing a great deal in Ukraine itself and the regions which are mostly impacted, because WFP was dealing with 120 countries, their funds to the tune of 12.5 million population they were serving. So this has been very badly impacted with a humanitarian crisis as a spin-off of this conflict.
So Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe is also closely monitoring this conflict in Europe. How important is the role of these organizations when we talk about these conflicts, or these are all just talking points and talking platforms?
You see, these organizations are doing their best to mediate and to come up with certain initiatives which would lower the temperatures, offer the options. But we must be very clear about the entire mosaic of security, energy complications, and the whole instability that this conflict has spawned. This started with the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008, and where the sensibilities of Russia, they were not properly, I think, estimated, and they were not placated to the tune that the Russia wanted the NATO's expansion. The Ukraine and Georgia was actively encouraged. So the whole thing had a implacable momentum as it continued. And in 2014, once the Russians they annexed Crimea, so that was again a moment in which the NATO's expansion towards their backyard should have been treated with a little more circumspection. But since it was done, and it was a very clear pronunciation by the European powers that NATO would expand and take Ukraine within its umbrella, and Ukraine evinced its willingness. So there onwards, I think the events took their own momentum. The Donbas region, which is mostly unstable because of the Russian population, the insurrection and its further impacts, it impacted so badly that United Nations, they wanted interventions, but once the only arm which can actively do something in a conflict is the UN Security Council. So, see, UN Security Council has Russia as a veto wielding member. So therein lies the dilemma. What UN can perhaps do is to encourage this multilateral interaction, because there are other powers like China, that European Union countries are mostly impacted. In fact, the energy, once you see the energy dependence, it is the European Union which is mostly impacted. Germany is dependent 30% of its energy needs on Russia.
Right.
France 40%. And as you go east, the dependency increases. The Baltic nations, they are even more dependent. Poland and Poland is around Poland and Hungary 40 to 50%, and countries like Finland, they are dependent 90% on Russian gas.
So of course, European Union countries are mostly impacted by this conflict. How do you view the role and the diplomatic efforts as well as the economic efforts put by European Union? Because of course, most of the countries of the European Union have shown unity when we talk about this conflict.
You see, we know that there were countries like France, Germany, Italy, Spain, which had a view on NATO's expansion earlier on also. So they had been giving a consistent response to overtures for for NATO's expansion, but their opinion probably was overshadowed by the desire of other European countries and United States to expand the NATO umbrella, because that was you remember, there is a very interesting discourse by John Mearsheimer. He says that it was a unipolar moment, and United States wanted a liberal international order, and they thought that in that unipolar moment, such transgressions or such initiatives would not be countenanced very aggressively by Russia. But I think that was a miscalculation, and now once that unipolarity has morphed into multipolarity, it's a multipolar world now, so there are so many poles, so it's very difficult to attain the kind of balance of power that obtained in a unipolar moment.
Of course.
So that was a miscalculation, and the United Nations, organizations like EU Parliament, OSCE, and even there are multilateral organizations which have been impacted. ASEAN has been impacted,
SCO.
and SCO has been impacted because it's a butterfly effect, as I say.
Of course,
the entire world, the energy prices have shot up. The Brent crude price, once it touched $100, it impacted everybody. Russia was the largest fertilizer exporter of the world. Once the fertilizer export was stopped, even countries like Pakistan, which are DAP prices and DAP exports, they are impacted directly because of that.
Of course, they were impacted, but this also highlights maybe the limitations of multilateral institutions and multilateralism as well. Are there some reforms or changes being proposed to enhance the effectiveness of these multilateral organizations to address and deal with such conflicts?
So, Mariam, there is a discussion going on in expanding the UN Security Council number of seats, and India is like trying very hard to get a permanent seat in the United Nations. As we can like now see, there is a very political issue. It's like very politically charged. Other than that, other multilateral institutions, for example, the SCO, the BRICS, G77 we discussed last time, G20, all of these multilateral institutions or like these groupings, they're like now vying for a new world order as well. And one other aspect that we like did not discuss, and when these sanctions on Russia were being circumvented, there is also talks and discussions on removing the dollar domination in the global financial de-dollarization. So there is a discussion now taking place between the emerging economies, especially from the BRICS era, China, Russia. Russia is now basically selling oil to a lot of countries, and they are not dealing in USDs. They're like getting either the inflows in yuans or rubles. So there's this whole like movement now on like a new financial order is also like being discussed. So there are like multiple effects happening across the world. It is having a massive impact on Pakistan as well when it comes to the oil prices. We are very dependent on like the petroleum prices in Pakistan are like through the roof. They're like very heavily dependent on the international markets as well, and Pakistan now, because of the whole discussions with the IMF, cannot like give subsidies, and they have to be transferred to the end user as well.
Of course. So this conflict has impacted emerging economies and developing countries like Pakistan the most, and of course we have witnessed that maybe food has also become a geopolitical football, and this has become an important tool for diplomacy as well. So how Pakistan is navigating all this environment, and what changes in foreign policy are required? Like, of course, Dr. Jaspal also mentioned about that we need to shift our foreign policy as well. So what kind of changes do you suggest?
So when it comes to using food supplies as a tool of geopolitics, it's a very dangerous game that is like being played, because a lot of like global politics or like global conflicts, they basically emerge when there are like issues related to water shortages or food. And
even the Arab Spring was as a result
because of that in Tunisia, basically because of the food inflation. Other than that, a lot of like conflict prone areas in Africa, for example, Middle East, even like Afghanistan, Pakistan region, a lot of like these dynamics come into play. So these are like very important to counter. Now your question on the Pakistan side, we first have to look inwards. Pakistan is an agricultural country, and Pakistan has one of the lowest per acre yields in the world when it comes to producing
the quality
of the wheat and like and the technology that we use. We don't even do industrial farming. So now through SIFC there is like this discussion on corporate farming that will be taking place, in which a lot of like land which was previously not arable or like not fertilized will be converted into producing a lot more wheat previously. So we are like in the process of partnering with like some GCC countries. We are in the process of like getting like like advanced seeds or like machinery that is like required to do farming at that scale. Even right now Pakistan does not do corporate farming, and we are like dependent on small like farming communities to basically physically go and like do all of that.
So transfer of technology is
very important, and irrigation systems. Now the world has moved into drip irrigation. Like if you look at countries like Israel, which invented this process, they converted deserts into fertilized lands, and they are like now completely self-sufficient when it comes to production of wheat. Pakistan being an agricultural country, there are like times then because of like the climate crisis or because of the massive flooding, we basically, our whole like wheat, crops are like eliminated, and then we have to like import a lot of them, and Russia and like Ukraine were one of the countries where Pakistan was importing all of these like wheat. So first of all, we have to look inwards and be self-sufficient in the crops that we're like already, producing.
So, Dr. Jaspal, of course, this is very important, but let's talk about sanctions imposed on Russia by the West. United States and EU also has imposed sanctions on Russia. How these sanctions have evolved over time since the start of war, and how this has impacted Pakistan's relations within the region and beyond?
I think that these sanctions have a great impact on the economies of the developing states, especially when they tried to bleed the Russia, they stopped it, but the many states which were a beneficiary of the Russian grain, Russian oil, and similarly from the other, they are affected. At the same time, we cannot forget that this war, as it was earlier pointed out by my other panelists, that if starting from 2008, Bucharest, when the Russians made it clear that don't interfere in our neighborhood, but at the same time NATO and the Americans interfered. But today when we look about it, it's a great impact on Pakistan as well. For instance, the Americans wishes that we condemn the war in totality like their NATO members. But we are living in a region in which Russia has a great impact, and we wanted, and our national security policy document released in 2022, it very categorically, 2020, categorically stated that Pakistan is going to adopt a neutral policy, by people-centric policy, and geo-economics is our preference. Keeping in mind our official security doctrine, then we have to not be a part of any kind of a organization, or any kind of a bloc or alliance. In this context, the Western nations have been pressurizing us. Similarly, the Russians wanted that we support them.
Right.
But at the same time, what I want to add is that this Ukrainian war is not a simplistic. It is bleeding the Europe, it is bleeding the developing world, and it is alarming about the probability of the use of nuclear weapons.
So let's talk about the role of China. Of course, China is very close to Russia, and but there is a perceived notion in the West that Russia is isolated. How significant is this alliance for Pakistan, and how do you view this situation evolving in future?
I think that in the 21st century, no state can isolate the other state. Too much overdeveloping, too much interdependency. As a point, let me make it clear that in the 21st century, no state can isolate the other. Even the American sanctions have been criticized because it impacted the America as well. Russia is not isolated because China is the leading power. China and the Russia axis is becoming very significant. Chinese have given a role which was supported to the Russians that I can play a role of mediation between the Russia and the Ukraine.
Right, of course, these sanctions have also impacted different regions of the world, but food security remains an important challenge. And of course, when we talk about food security, climate issues are also emerging as a result of using these energy resources by the European countries as well as some of the developing countries as well. How do you see that Pakistan is addressing the intersection of these challenges, posed by climate change as well as food security and energy security?
So, Mariam, this is a two-tiered response that I want to give you. First of all, other than the climate issue and moving more towards sustainable, avenues of
renewable energy resources,
renewable energy, that will take a lot of investments by the global north to invest in countries. Now, because of this whole crisis that has emerged in Europe, a lot of these countries are supporting Ukraine in terms of supplying weapons. Other than that, the whole migration crisis, and then that coupled with the global inflations. So the investments from the global north to the global south when it comes to sustainability or climate related investments, or moving towards alternative sources of even production or sustainability, is becoming challenging. even when Pakistan basically got like a lot of like support from the European countries in after the floods of 2020, and then we remember there was the conference in Geneva in which there was like a lot of like pledges made. All of those pledges have also not come through because of this pressure that is like there on the European countries or the countries of the global north. So moving or like towards more alternative forms of energy would be very challenging. The other part of the challenge is the already growing prices of energy in Pakistan. So gas prices, fuel prices, they're already through the roof a lot, and that's like impacting our energy. Other than that, it's also like affecting our industrial production as well. Now, in one way, when we have to increase our exports, when we have to increase our production, how will we do that when we are not globally competitive? When we cannot provide cheap energy to our industrial sector to produce all of these like goods and services. So right now this is like looking very dismal picture is like being painted, and this like crisis
and
needs to be resolved. There's a lot of uncertainty, and that will also impact the foreign direct investment coming to Pakistan.
So uncertainty particularly impacts the foreign direct investments coming in the country as well. But when we talk about regional economic corridors and regional economic cooperation, that is very significant. Do you think that can act as a buffer specifically in regard to these monoculture economies and the developing countries, and how can Pakistan deal with its neighbors and look at the options for diversifying its economy?
Every economy would be impacted, monocultural, bicultural, it's a complete impact which we have to visualize, because economies like Nigeria, which are dependent, 75% of their budget is on refined petroleum, so they are directly impacted. Middle Eastern countries impacted by food. There are European economies, they are impacted directly because of the energy crisis, and even United States is impacted.
True.
How? They have filled in the gap, and the Russian energy, gas which was being supplied, United States picked up the tab, and out of their strategic reserves, which used to be 1 year, now it has come down to 40. It's a serious depletion. So there's a debate going on in the United States also to find a kind of a solution, and I think their strategy is to enhance the cost of war so much that the Russia also comes onto the negotiating table, but the Russia regards this war differently. So it's going to be the asymmetry of will that will decide, and Europe has to find a way to develop alternative and diversified energy supply source, which is not easy, because even if you have LNG terminals, you don't have how many years would it take to develop a LNG terminal?
True.
And how many years would it take to create an infrastructure as a replacement of that infrastructure which you are
and
dependent.
The security of infrastructure is another
Yes,
question mark.
Exactly, and some experts say that it would take more than a decade. So it's not in the interest of any country to see the continuation of this war. It would be a win-win formulation if this war ends soon, and the multilateral diplomacy has to step in.
True.
Because there are interests in the Western hemisphere. The military industrial complex is getting rich, but the world is getting poor. So we need to resort to multilateral diplomacy. China, for its own reasons, might not be very actively engaged beyond a certain point, because maybe that war is keeping the USI away from East Asia, where AUKUS, Quad and the Taiwan Straits play out.
Right. Dr. Jaspal, lastly tell us what are some of the lessons that the international community, the world, including Pakistan, can learn from Russia-Ukraine war regarding conflict prevention and resolution?
I think that the first lesson is that we cannot interfere in the internal affairs or in the areas of influence of the other countries. Second is that hegemony or a unipolarity is not acceptable to the rest of the world. That's the reason since the Bucharest Americans have been trying to have a unipolarity, but it miserably failed and Russia invaded. And third is United Nations Security Council resolution or the sovereignty of the state must be honored and respected. In this context, sooner, as it was very rightly pointed out earlier, that sooner the war is ended, it's better, because the world is suffering because of this war. Of course, Ukrainians and Russians are suffering, the Europeans are suffering, and the developing world is equally suffering. So in this context, we have learned that war is not suitable. We can resolve or manage the conflict through the dialogue and then move towards the dialogue, conflict resolution through the dialogue. And instead of highlighting or you can undermining the sensitivities of the other, it's better that we can encourage the dialogue process and the rule of law. That is the good. That is the only mean for the safety and security and prosperity of the entire world.
Of course. Thank you very much, Dr. Zafar Nawaz Jaspal, for joining us in today's program. Thank you very much, Mr. Shahyar Khan, for joining us in today's program. Thank you very much, Mr. Rashid Wali, for joining us in today's program. Of course, in today's program, we discussed about the global implications of Russia-Ukraine war, and of course, the economic implications as well as the implications regarding food security can be felt across the globe. And this is crucial time for the world leaders to sit and to talk about these challenges that are impacting not only the developing countries but throughout the world. They are impacting people of the world. So of course, when we talk about these challenges, only cooperation and dialogue is the way forward, and this time is crucial than ever. That's all from Game Changer tonight. Take care. Allah Hafiz.